It's no wonder that slavery then was as important to the world economy as oil is today. It was the economic engine.
That's an interesting analogy, oil and slavery. The famous convention of 1776, where we got our declaration, there were 17 delegates to there. Of those 17, they had 1,400 slaves among them.
Yeah.
How important is it for us to understand our history in that realistic sense?
Sort of the cliche is, if you don't understand your history, you're condemned to repeat it, and we just sort of fluff that off. But if you think deeply about these issues and understand what it is that we inherit from our background, from our history, you can just look at your own family and see the things that you inherit from your parents and grandparents. But make the extrapolation to us as a society, and you look at what took place 200 years ago and 400 years ago, and the things that we did not fix in ways that we treated each other really poorly, still end up causing us damage today. And what we end up inheriting today are systems of injustice that have not been fixed. And you can find the seeds of those in the history. And you can find it in the seeds of the enslavement system, and then up into the Civil War, the 12-year period of Reconstruction, the 100-year period of Jim Crow, the civil rights period of the 50s and 60s, when laws changed but practices were very slow to follow, to economic policies, government policies that benefited white people, particularly GIs coming back from World War II. 98% of the GI Bill dollars went to white veterans, not black. And so consequently, we build up a whole bunch of white suburbs and leave poor people, which end up being a lot of people of color, in the urban areas, urban centers, and you've got all these wonderful suburbs, which are then more valuable. And what do we use to pay for our schools? Property taxes. So the places with the most money for property taxes are these valuable and wealthy suburbs, and the urban areas today have the hardest time with schools compared to the people who live outside. That's, you follow the path. You need to be able to connect the dots, and if you're missing dots anywhere along the way, we don't understand why it is that we have such disparities in economic systems between these areas, and why it is that we're more segregated today than we were when I was in school in the 60s and 70s.
So you really have a position of the legacy of slavery lives with us in many different ways.
Many ways
that we don't deal with. I want to pull you back though to your travel, and from Ghana you went to Cuba.
Right.
Why?
Found out this family owned 5 sugar and coffee plantations in Cuba.
The DeWolf family.
The DeWolf family from the, I believe it was the very early 1800s. We know for sure it was through the 1850s. I have a hunch that it was much longer than that. But because of our embargo, our relationship with the country of Cuba, doing research there is very, very difficult. And so even though I know I have cousins there, there's really no way at the present time to be able to identify who those folks are. But going to Cuba, I mean, all of the Caribbean islands, all of the West Indies, were a lot of sugar. And sugar was another one of those commodities that was like valuable, literally like gold. And Cuba, once you had the revolution in Haiti that overthrew the French and the slaves freed themselves, the enslaved people there, their sugar business collapsed. Nobody would trade with them. We have crushed Haiti ever since. So Cuba takes over as the sugar capital of the world, and many Americans came over and bought up land and had plantations, and the DeWolf family was one of those. And so we were able to find the location of 2 using old maps, and one of them still had the crumbling ruins of one of the plantation structures. And that actually shows up in the film when we were at that location.
And we should mention the title of the film is
Traces of the Trade: A Story from the Deep North. And then, with my book Inheriting the Trade, Katrina and I decided that we would have very separate each is our own version of our journey. And so the book stands on its own, the film stands on its own, and they both obviously complement each other because we were on the same journey. But I didn't watch while she edited, and she didn't have anything to do with my manuscript. We saw each other's final versions before they were published in January of 2008.
When I was doing some research for the interview, it struck me about all the compromises and all the subtle adjustments in order to maintain the economic institution of slavery. I think there were 5 clauses in the original Constitution. No taxes if you sell a slave. I think was it 3/5 of a slave that
is
gave
counted. Yeah, towards
your population, and that means an electoral college vote that favors the South.
Correct.
The 3/4 in order to amend the Constitution. There was a period also where I think it was 10 years by law, Congress couldn't even talk about repealing slavery or the trade.
It was actually 20 years from when the Constitution was adopted, which is why January 1st, 1808 is when the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade was outlawed in this country because it couldn't happen any earlier because of our Constitution. And that's the reason that we wanted my book and the film to come out in January of 2008, because that was the 200th anniversary of that abolition. And, Great Britain spent something like $40,000, government dollars, not counting private dollars, on commemorating this. I mean, there was museums built. There was a whole education programs set up. They really went all out in talking about the transition from a system of enslavement to a system of freedom. And in this country, virtually nothing was done. A study group was set up by Congress, and then the funding was stripped out from it before it was put into place just a few months before the actual anniversary. So it was, it was local museums and history professors and colleges that actually were the only ones that really made the effort to commemorate that important step in our history. If the slave trade had not been outlawed, there would have been so many more people of African descent in this country. Our population would look an awful lot more like Brazil than the way that we look today. There would have been a lot more, we would have a lot darker skin as a nation, and a lot more mixture of culture than even we do today.
Well, 1808, outlawing of the African slave trade.
Correct.
But it seemed politically there were 2 issues. There were people who said, I'm against the African slave trade, but we're not against slavery. How did that work?
A lot of abolitionists supported the end of the slave trade, but they wanted to ship everybody back to Liberia, the newly created nation in West Africa, for freed slaves. And a lot of people went back to Liberia. A lot did not. Most did not. And but abolitionists in the North, again, painting ourselves as these noble abolitionists, they still didn't like black people. It wasn't a universal, let's all love each other, kumbaya. There was still a great deal of systemic racism at the core of a belief system in which white people are superior. We're going to do our best to prove it scientifically, support from the Bible, support with laws. And so that's part of the history that I think is important for us to understand, is that let's celebrate our successes. Let's celebrate how far we've come in the last 200 years and recognize just how difficult it was to achieve those successes and what it was that we ourselves were doing to stop ourselves along the way.
I want to read just one more quote, and this is to illustrate where the Supreme Court of the United States of America was for more than half a century. And this is Chief Justice Roger Taney, who is talking about the Dred Scott case.
Yeah.
Somebody who had gone to Minnesota, had been a slave, but Minnesota was a free area. And his judgment was, being of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they have no rights which the white man is bound to respect. That's chilling when you hear that our country, a democracy, and our chief legal officer says something like that.
And I think this is definitely related. When you mention that, I've stood in the room that was the courtroom for the Dred Scott case in St. Louis, Missouri. And to be in those spaces gives you a whole different, I think, vision and to touch history. And one of the things that I think is so important in educating ourselves is, yes, read books, but actually visiting places, to walk the battlefields of Gettysburg, to go through Greenwood District in Tulsa, to go into the Greenwood Cultural Center and look at the quotes from people who survived the race riot in 1921, to go to the John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park and read the plaques and learn the history of what took place in that one incident here in Tulsa. I think is a way that is so powerful in helping people to understand a lot more about the place in which people who live here in Tulsa can get in touch with their history. But traveling around the country, traveling internationally, I wouldn't have the feelings I do without having stood in slave dungeons. And everywhere I go now, I try to find, go to Cincinnati and go to the Underground Railroad Museum, travel to Memphis and go to the Civil Rights Museum, formerly the Lorraine Motel, where Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Going to Birmingham, Alabama, to 6th Street Avenue Baptist Church, where 4 little girls were murdered in a bombing on a Sunday morning just before church was to start. Being in places where history happened, and obviously we're talking about the history of slavery and racism and what have you, but any aspect of history, I really encourage people to make the effort to educate ourselves so that we can understand what it is that we inherit and why it is that we are who we are today. Who's getting discriminated against today and why. We're land of the free, home of the brave, everything's equal. But it's not. And why is that? It's understanding history will help us to understand why we're in the situation that we remain in today.
Well, you've answered my part of the question I was going to ask you, and that would be, and I'll state this, some people disagree with you. They would say that, why talk about this now? We traveled that path. We are where we are. We have an African-American president. This is the land of opportunity, and everything is equal. What would you tell those people?
And a lot of folks will say, and Oprah Winfrey is rich, and Bill Cosby's rich, and Michael Jordan, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence of people who've done really, really well who are people of color. But if you look at any social indicator over the broad society, white people do much better than black people do, and that's health care, education, jobs, treatment by the criminal justice system, you name it. Black babies, the probability of them dying as babies compared to white babies, anything you want to measure. And I will tell you this, and this may come across as a little controversial, and so be it, is all of the people who will say what you just said are white people. And if we, as white people of European descent, will take the time to actually listen to what black folks say, or to what Hispanic folks say, or Asian folks, or Native, American Indian folks say, we can learn an awful lot from people that we tend not to listen to, we tend not to pay attention to, we tend not to talk to, unless it's about, how about those Sooners? Right? We can all agree on a football game, have a great time, have some peanuts and beer. But when we talk seriously about our relationships as human beings, about our shared humanity in this wonderful country, and why is it that our ideals from over 200 years ago have still not been achieved for all people, there's reasons, and I think that we can learn a lot from each other, but it takes the commitment to communicate with each other seriously, to develop the kind of relationships where we can create the spaces to have these conversations, whether it's at our church or school or what have you.
Thomas DeWolf, it's been an honor visiting with you.
Boy, it's been great for me too. Thanks so much.
And the book is Inheriting the Trade. It's a unique journey of a family looking at a history of slave trade in America. Thank you for joining us.